Hey guys, today I'm going to teach you how to design a suit to make you look taller. Right? So we have quite a few clients who I like to say are vertically challenged, and they always want to look a little bit taller and longer and leaner. So today I'm going to talk about some of the design elements I go about thinking about when I want to kind of like stretch someone's like silhouette. So we're going to start with the jacket. Right, so the jacket plays kind of a major role here. This is a suit that I made for a client who's, I think he's 5'6", I believe. First things first, I'd like to talk about the lapel, right? The lapel is one of the most important conversations when we're designing a suit in general, but for a shorter guy, it's going to be pretty important actually. So this line right here, this is called the gorge line. So the gorge line is the line, the stitch line basically that matches the back collar and the lapel, right? So depending on where this is placed, this will play a kind of a major role in terms of like how the actual person is viewed. So for me, I like on a shorter guy, I like to put this this gorge line relatively high on the actual jacket itself. And the reason being is you get this really long lean lapel line, right? And that'll kind of just stretch out the silhouette and just make them look a little bit longer, right? So that's kind of the first thing I do. The second thing that I often take into account is actually the button stance. Right, so button stance plays a major role in terms of how long this lapel line is as well, but it also takes into account how much like torso someone's kind of working with, right? So for me, I like a relatively low button stance, and for shorter guys, sometimes we actually do a single button stance, right? So as opposed to doing a 2-button jacket, we'll actually do a 1-button jacket to really kind of roll this out to make it like really long and lean. Right, so that's another option. It varies on how much how much chest and torso someone has, but I prefer to do something really low, just so we get this really long lean line, and it just kind of like stretches out their silhouette a little bit. Other things to take into account. When it comes to a shorter guy, we often like to do soft shoulders on a shorter person's jacket. The reason being is if you add too much structure in the actual shoulder, he'll look really square and just kind of make him look a little bulkier, right? So you're adding more width going this way versus doing a softer shoulder where it just kind of makes him look a little bit leaner and longer, right? Another thing to take into account is the actual hip pocket. So if a shorter guy is also a little bit stout, what we often do is something called a jetted pocket on the hip. And the reason being is it just kind of takes away a little bit of attention from like his natural hip, right? Just keeping it a little bit cleaner, keeping that eye kind of going from shoulder all the way down to the jacket, and just keeping it really long and lean. Okay, so that's something to take into account too. You can do flat pockets. You can do a couple other different options of pockets, but I personally like the jetted pocket for a shorter gentleman. Okay, moving on to the sleeve of the jacket. So with the sleeve of the jacket, often kind of the rule of thumb is you want to show between 1/4 and 3/4 of an inch of cuff. The way I go about doing this for a shorter guy is I actually like to kind of show a little bit more, right? So I show typically like 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of sleeve. And the reason I do that is to kind of make it seem that they're almost like too tall for their jacket, right? That their sleeves are kind of popping out a little bit more than what you would traditionally expect, right? So that's something I often do also. Okay, so let's move on to the trouser, right? So when it comes to the actual trouser, I always like to say we want a high-waisted trouser on these guys. The reason being is I want a really long lean leg line all the way down, right? You don't necessarily have to do suspenders, completely up to you, but I want them relatively high, and the best way to get them high and keep them high is with suspenders, especially if that shorter gentleman is a little bit stout, right? So that's something to take into account. Another thing that I like to do is I want to do a relatively slimmer silhouette on the actual trouser itself. What a slimmer silhouette on the leg will actually do is just make you look a little bit longer and leaner, right? Just kind of continuing that line from kind of top all the way down to the bottom, right? Just kind of really stretching out that silhouette as much as humanly possible. Another thing about the actual waistline is you never want to go about wearing a belt if you are a shorter guy, especially when it comes to kind of tailored clothing and wearing suits. The reason being is a belt will actually break your silhouette in half, right? So it does the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, right? We're trying to kind of stretch things out, make things look long and lean. A belt will actually kind of break your silhouette into 2 different pieces, right? And just make you look a little shorter. And then in terms of the trouser length, I would say trouser length, we want to go either kissing the top of the shoe, or we want to go a little bit shorter. The reason being is kind of similar to the sleeve, right? We want to make you look like you're almost like too tall for your suit, right? So that's one thing that we often do with some of our shorter clients as well. And then in terms of color, color is going to play a bit of a role here as well, right? So for color, I always like to do something a little bit darker. You don't necessarily have to do a black like this suit here. You could do kind of like a really deep navy, but keeping the color like solid is going to play a major role, right? Because what will happen if you wear kind of a suit like mine is it just kind of like stretch you out a little bit and stretch you out horizontally versus vertically, right? We're looking for a lot of kind of like vertical height here. We're not looking for much kind of width, right? Especially on a guy who's a little bit more stout and shorter, right? Doesn't mean you can't, that you can't wear a print. It's just if we're doing a print, we want it to be a little bit finer. And if you really want to be safe, I would say just go for a darker color all the way across. Okay, so those are some of the things that I often think about when I'm designing a suit for a shorter guy. If you want to design a suit with me, feel free to hit me up, and then we can talk about some of the design details that will make a big difference with kind of like stretching out your silhouette and making you look like you're 6'5". All right, guys, thank you for watching, and we will talk soon.